like to welcome you tonight to Concordia College. My name is Joyce Kennedy, and I'm the Senior Director of Community Relations here, and welcome once again. We've all heard the stories around the holiday table, the family folklore or myth about some incredible life-saving, jaw-dropping, or risky adventure that seems too surreal to be real. And with each retelling, the story takes on new twists and turns, adds more characters, and becomes larger than life. Yvette Manessis Corporon grew up in New Rochelle, listening to her grandmother's stories about how the people of the small Greek island Erikos hid a Jewish family, a tailor named Savas and his daughters, from the Nazis during World War II. As an adult, Yvette couldn't get the story of the Jewish tailor out of her head. With over 20 years of experience in television news, Yvette has traveled the world covering the biggest stories in news and entertainment. So she decided to put her investigative journalism skills to work and track down the Jewish tailor's descendants, and eventually found them in Israel. Their tearful reunion was proof to her that evil doesn't always win. But 3 days after she made this incredible connection, her nephew and his grandfather were shot and killed, victims of a crazed neo-Nazi gunman. As Yvette and her family wrestled with this tragedy, the lessons she learned from the survivors of the Holocaust and her unending quest to honor the islanders who risked everything to save them taught Yvette that in the midst of pain, something beautiful still can happen. Something Beautiful Happened is Yvette's second novel, her first being When the Cypress Whispers, an international bestseller published in 2014. An Emmy Award-winning writer, producer, and author, Yvette is currently a senior producer with the syndicated entertainment news show Extra. In addition to her 3 Emmy Awards, Yvette has received several Emmy nominations, a Silurian Award for Excellence in Journalism, and the New York City Comptroller and City Council's Award for Greek Heritage and Culture. Yvette lives in Lawrence Park West with her husband, Emmy Award-winning photojournalist David Corporon, and their 2 children, her son Nico, an 8th grader at the Chapel School across the street, and daughter Christiana, who also graduated from Chapel School and is a junior at Ursuline. Kirkus Review wrote of Something Beautiful Happened. There is an undeniable emotional power in the connections Yvette's story helps forge between the living and the dead, some of whom might otherwise be forgotten. As we listen tonight to Yvette tell us her story, let's reflect on our own stories around the table and find inspiration for keeping our own family history alive for the next generation. Please join me in welcoming Yvette Manessis Corporon.
Hi, everybody. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, mic is on. Hi, thank you, Joyce. That was a beautiful introduction. I have to tell you guys, no matter how many times I tell this story, and I tell it a lot because I talk a lot, you'll learn this about me very soon. I'm amazed when I hear someone else tell it. Like, I'm sitting there, it's my story, I wrote the book, and I'm like almost in tears listening to Joyce tell it because I still can't believe that it actually really happened. Really, really happened. And so thank you for coming out on this very frigid night. I hope that we have a wonderful evening together. There will probably be some laughter, usually at my expense. There will be some tears, usually mine. Some tears of laughter, some tears of incredible emotions, an incredible story, and a journey that lasted more than 70 years, and one that I'm very, very honored to tell. See, I'm going to start crying already. Many of you know me, which is why I'm so emotional, because, you know, I grew up with these people. My friends from church, my friends from school, friends that my children grew up with, and many of you have lived this journey with me. And it means so much to me to be able to be here with you at home. You know, I travel all around the country and around the world telling this story, sharing this story, and it means so much to me to tell it at home. Sorry, here I go again. Okay, I promise. I told you I cry. We're going to get that out of the way. And I tend to talk with my hands a lot, too. My Greek friends understand that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this incredible journey. But before I do, I want to just take a moment and acknowledge something. I grew up in the north end of New Rochelle, and it means a lot to me that we're here at Concordia sharing this story together, because it was here in this neighborhood. I grew up in New Rochelle, I went to Davis School, I went to Ursuline, and it was here in this community that my drive for telling stories began. And every time I speak at a school, before I tell the story, I just always say, stop and look at where we are. Look at where we are. Look at this community. Students in the room, raise your hands. Who's a student here? Student, raise your hands. Okay, this is for you guys. Stop and take a moment and look around you. Pay attention to the incredible, incredible place, incredible opportunities. You are surrounded by amazing teachers, right, who are devoting themselves to helping you. And it was a teacher who brought me here, who built me and this journey along with me. I was in 7th grade at the Ursuline School, and my grandfather had just passed away. And the assignment that our 7th grade English teacher gave us was to write a book of poems. So I did. I poured all of my emotions about losing my grandfather into this book of poems. And when she graded it, she gave it back to me. It was Mrs. McKevely, and I got an A. And she wrote a note. And she wrote in her note, "You will be a great writer one day." And I filed that away, and I never thought I would actually be a writer, right? Everyone kind of thinks they have a book in them. Could you really do it? But I just kind of always remembered what Mrs. McKevely wrote. And you guys remember this, because I forgot about what she said. And I went on, and I had a career. I was a journalist, and I had a family. I did all these cool things. But then I started to think that maybe I could write a book, right? Is it a challenge to myself? Could I write a book? And I wrote a book, but I was rejected for so many years. Rejection after rejection. This isn't any good. Your writing is not good enough. No one will ever publish this. Well, guess what? I kept remembering what Mrs. McKevely said, and it kept me sending it out again and again, rejection after rejection. And that book that people told me was no good was translated into 14 languages and was an international bestseller. And Mrs. McKevely inspired me to keep trying. So, just wanted to put that out there. Take a moment and just appreciate where we are and the incredible educators in our lives and, you know, what they do and how they inspire us, because it's real. It is real. And I wouldn't be here in front of you today if it wasn't for that. So, that said, as I mentioned, I grew up in New Rochelle, just down the road. I went to Davis School, and I was the only Greek girl in a very Jewish community. You guys probably know what that's like to be the only Greek kid, right? I was the only Greek girl. All my friends every Wednesday went to Hebrew school. I wanted to go to Hebrew school. I had to go to Greek school. Greek school was awful. It was terrible. I hated it. I hated it. And my friends got to go to Hebrew school, and every Thursday morning they would come in, and they would tell me stories of like who was flirting with who did what, and I was like, I want to be with you. I wanted to be Jewish. I wanted to be just like them. Now, my Jewish friends also had something else in common. They had really, really cool grandmothers that they called like Nana and Booby, and the Nanas and Boobies took them shopping to like Macy's and Bloomingdale's, and they got their hair done, and they wintered in Miami. And I was like, that is awesome. They made them Rice Krispie treats. I didn't have a Booby. I had a Yaya, right? And my Yaya, that's the Greek word for grandmother, spoke no English. She was from a little tiny island in Greece called Erikusa. She was illiterate. Back then, on the island, there was no reason for girls to be educated. Their job was to first be devoted to their parents, and then to their husbands and children, and maintain a wonderful Greek Orthodox home. And that's what my Yaya did beautifully. But she was never educated. She never traveled outside of Greece or the U.S. She was a very simple woman. She didn't drive. She lived in this country for 40 years. She didn't speak any English, but she watched all my children and could tell you who was doing what to whom. She got that down. It was like a Yaya secret superpower or something. And she didn't make Rice Krispie treats or mac and cheese. She made like fish head soup, and she would suck the eyeballs, literally, out of the fish heads. And this was my Yaya, and she dressed in black because she was a widow, and she wore the black headscarf, and she lived with us. She came to live with us after my grandfather passed away. That was the Greek tradition. Widows wear black for the rest of their lives and never marry again. So my Yaya, like so many Yayas of her generation, came to live with us in our home. And I loved her dearly. Don't get the wrong impression. She was the most beautiful, amazing person, but she was different. And when you're a kid, when you're a daughter of immigrants, sometimes you don't want to be so different. And I didn't want to be so different. I wanted to be like all my friends. And we were not at all. And there was a part of me that was like, why do we have to be Greek? But okay, I loved my Greek life. I would spend every summer in Greece with my family, and it was amazing. But there was very much a part of me that felt like an outsider, that felt different. that felt embarrassed, right? My grandmother didn't summer in Boca. She didn't speak a word of English. But when my friends came over, she would jump up and she would say, "Hello, Dalimu." That was her English way of saying, "Hello, darling," and run to the stove and make them something to eat. Because what she lacked in material goods or in education, she more than made up for in love and warmth. And as much as I loved my yaya, I don't think I really appreciated that when she was with us and when she was alive, because I was so focused on how different we were. Now, my yaya loved nothing more than to tell us stories about her life in Greece. And she lived through World War II on our little island. Now, our little island is called Erikusa, and it's a little tiny, tiny speck of dust on the map, when you can find it on the map, because it's really not even on many maps. It's in the northwest portion of Greece, the most northwestern point of Greece, right off of the coast of Corfu, between Albania and Italy. So we're from this little tiny island, and during World War II, my grandmother was left alone on Erikusa with her 2 young children, my father, who was 9, and his sister, Agatha, who was 7. My grandfather, like so many men of the generation of the time, came to America to work in the diners and save money and eventually send for his family and come live their American dream. But then war broke out and he couldn't get to the family. So my grandmother was left on Erikusa without her husband during wartime, during first the Italian and then the German occupation. And she loved telling me stories about her life in Greece. And one of the stories that she loved telling me about most was about her friends, the Jewish family, the family of Savas Israel. Now, Yaya would tell me that Savas Israel was her friend. He was a Jewish tailor from the main island of Corfu. Now, I wasn't kidding when I said our island is so tiny. There are no shops, there was no police, there was no doctor, there was nothing. When the islanders, like my yaya, wanted or needed a new article of clothing, they would scrape together their money, get on a fishing boat, make the 7-mile journey to the main island, take a bus down to the city, to the Jewish quarter of Corfu. There was a Jewish quarter in the town where the community was about 2,000 strong. There were about 2,000 Jews, as deeply rooted in this island and as Greek as my own family. Well, of course, the Nazis didn't see it that way, did they? So my grandmother became friends with this Jewish tailor named Savas and his 3 daughters. He had 3 daughters named Julia, Nina, and Spera. And whenever she needed an article of clothing made, she would make the journey to Corfu, go to the shop, and as she waited for her clothing, she would talk with the girls, and they became quite close. Now, in June of 1944, the Germans occupied Corfu, and they realized that time was running out. And so they set on a mission to exterminate every single Jew on the beautiful island of Corfu, 2,000 of them. They gathered them on June 4th of 1944. They put them into the square at gunpoint. They then put them into the old fort, the fort that was built to protect them and their families. They were herded into the fort, and then onto boats to the main island, to the cattle cars, to Auschwitz. 1,800 of that community died in the camps at Auschwitz, 1,800. Some managed to escape. Savas Israel and his daughters and a little girl named Rosa, who was with Savas and the family, managed to escape. They made it to my grandmother's island, to Erikusa. And my grandmother, my simple, illiterate, uneducated, spoke no English, made fish head soup and not mac and cheese grandmother, was one of a group of islanders who stood up and risked their lives to save them. Now, she loved telling me the story. She would tell me how at night she would hear the knock at the door. She would open the door and welcome Savas' daughters into the house, Nina, Spera, Julia, and little Rosa, who was 9 years old. Now, little Rosa, her entire family was wiped out by the Nazis. She wasn't home at the time. She was visiting with Savas and his daughters, so she escaped. Her entire family was killed. Savas brought her with him to Erikusa. Every night, my grandmother would hear that knock at the door. She would bring them inside. They would come in. Little Rosa would climb into bed with my Aunt Agatha, and they would whisper and fall asleep together, as my grandmother and Savas' daughter stayed up all night sewing and talking. Now, the Nazis went door to door on our island, and they told everyone, "We will kill you, we will kill your family, we will burn down this island if we find that anyone here is helping or hiding a Jew." Despite that, my grandmother never said a word, But not only that, no one on the island of Erikusa said a word. Even those who knew it was too dangerous and didn't want the Jewish family to hide there, even they didn't say a word to the Nazis, and the family survived. My father, who was 9, remembers the Nazis in our home, in my grandmother's bedroom, ransacking, screaming, "Where are the Jews? Where are the Jews?" Not a word. Everyone kept quiet, and the family was saved. Now, my yaya would tell me this story, or at least she would try. She would sit me down, she would make me something to eat, and she would tell me, there was a family, they were Jewish, they were our friends, we helped them, we've saved them. And I would listen, and I would pay attention, or at least I thought. Maybe for a few minutes, I'd get the headlines, and then I'd say, okay, Yaya, see you later, I have to go meet my friends. I have to go to my room and listen to my Duran Duran albums. You know, it was the 80s. And I never really stopped to pay full attention. I never really stopped to ask her questions. I never asked her, were you scared when the Nazis came to your door? Were you lonely when your husband left for America? I never asked. I never paid attention. And I have to also tell you, it was just like any other story. We sit here in this room, right, in this college in 2018, and we know what this story means. We know exactly what this means and how brave and how special these islanders were. But back when it happened, they didn't think of it in those terms. Back when it happened, it was just what you do. Why wouldn't you help your friend? Of course you help your friend. And it was just something that they knew they had to do. There were no acknowledgments, there were no accolades, there was no reward. They didn't seek it. They didn't ask for it. They never wanted it. And life went on. So when my grandmother would tell me this story, it was just another story during wartime, and life went on. My grandmother passed away, and I never had the opportunity to ask her the details that I care so deeply about now. It wasn't until years later, when I became a mother myself, when I was a journalist. I was working as a journalist, and I finally had small children. And I remember holding my daughter, Christiana, my little baby. This is where I tear up again. And I remember holding her in my arms and thinking about my grandmother's story. And it wasn't until that moment that it hit me. And I was like, wait a minute. Would I do that? Would I risk her life to save another woman's child? Would I open the door to my home to welcome these girls inside at risk of my own children's lives? And would I do as my grandmother did night after night when hundreds of thousands of people were starving all across Greece because there was no food during the war? Would I take food from my own children's plates and mouths every single night to put aside to feed another woman's children? And I thought about that. And I have to be honest with you, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. And if I told you, yes, of course I would be lying. Because do you know? How would you respond? How do you know what you would do in that situation unless you're really faced with that situation? And then I thought about that, and I was consumed with this tremendous guilt of how could I have not paid attention? How could I have not realized just how extraordinary my grandmother was, how incredible what happened on that island was. As a college student, I went to Israel. I studied journalism and international relations. I spent a semester all across Israel, and I went to Yad Vashem. I went to the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, and I remember walking through the Garden of the Righteous, right, where Gentiles are honored for risking their lives to save their Jewish friends during the war. And there are trees, all these beautiful trees, row after row of trees planted to honor people who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. And I remember being so overcome with emotion, looking at these beautiful trees, thinking, wow, what extraordinary people must have done this. But I never thought about my grandmother, not once. It wasn't until I became a mother that I was able to put it in perspective. And then the guilt was overwhelming. And I knew I had to do something with this. And I thought about it. And I thought about, okay, well, what can I do? What could I possibly do? And I thought, okay, well, maybe Mrs. McCavely was right. Maybe there's something I can do. Maybe I can use my voice on the page. Maybe I can write a story honoring my grandmother so many years later. Now, I didn't know all the details of the story because I never asked the questions. There was no one left to ask. There was no documentation. There was no proof. There was just a story. So instead, I sat down and I fictionalized my grandmother's story. And I wrote a novel based on her life and experiences. That novel is called When the Cypress Whispers, and it was published in 2014. And it is the story of a Greek-American woman and this magical relationship with her grandmother. And she goes back to Greece, and her grandmother shares all her secrets. And her grandmother shares with her all the magic and the beauty of family and myth and culture. And in that book, I got to ask all the questions that I never asked. And in that book, I got to have all the conversations that my grandmother and I never had. I put down on paper all the things I wish I would have done. And that book, that's the book that I was telling you about earlier that was rejected year after year, again and again and again. That book, my illiterate, uneducated grandmother's story on the page, became an international bestseller and was translated into 14 languages. All because I stopped to pay attention to my grandmother's story at last. But as I was writing that book, I realized that it wasn't enough. And it wasn't nearly enough, because that was fiction. And it wasn't enough for me to fictionalize my grandmother's story. I needed to finish it. I needed to find the family she risked her life to save. I was a journalist, after all. That's what I did. I tell stories for a living, right? I don't take no for an answer. I dig, and I find, and I discover. And I realized it was time to turn those skills inward into the only story that really, truly mattered to me, my grandmother's story. And I set out on what some called a crazy, crazy quest, crazy journey. And I tried for years and years. I went to Israel. I went to Greece. I went to the Jewish quarter. I went to the synagogue in Corfu, and I walked through the narrow alleys of the Jewish quarter, knocking on doors. Do you know the story of Savas Israel? Does anybody know what happened to Savas and the tailor? We knew that the family survived the war, and we knew that Savas died on Edikusa after the war of natural causes, but we didn't know what happened to his daughters. What happened? Are there people alive today because of the bravery of my grandmother in the islanders of Edikusa? No one knew. So I set out on a mission to see if I could. And it took years. And I got no after no, rejection after rejection. And on the verge of giving up, I remembered my trip to Israel as a college student and that beautiful garden at Yad Vashem. And I remembered the righteous. And it finally dawned on me that maybe my grandmother belonged in that beautiful garden as well. And I wrote to the righteous among nations. And I thought, they'll never pay attention to me. All I have is a story, a bunch of first names and an occupation, a tailor named Savas, his daughters, and an island. And just an old story passed down from a grandmother to a granddaughter. No proof, no documentation, nothing. Because there was no proof. Because at the time that my grandmother was helping to hide this family, and the Nazis went searching door to door, the islanders of Edikusa realized that if the Germans got hold of the island's records, they would know, they would be able to weed out which among them were not truly Greek Christians, but Jews hiding in plain sight as Christians. Jews who hid their clothing and dressed in the simple village peasant clothing of the islanders. And they would know and they would find them. So you know what the islanders of Edikusa did? They burned the records. They burned all the records on Edikusa to prevent this from happening. So I had no proof, no documentation, nothing. After a year of corresponding, came the reply from Yad Vashem, "I'm sorry, Yvette, we can't help you, there's nothing here." Nothing. And I said, "Thank you very much, okay, I know when to admit defeat. Can you please just send me what little information you have, what little you know?" And they did. They sent me an email with a couple of names. One of them was the name Vittorio Mustaki, and that is the name of a man that Spera, one of Savas' daughters, married. And I did what I had done maybe hundreds of times before. I went online, I Googled the name, nothing. I went to a genealogy database, myheritage.com, and I had done this dozens of times before with the names. But this time I plugged in the name Vittorio Mustaki. And you know what happened? A family tree popped up with all the names that I had been searching for. Turned out to be a false lead, because while Victorio and Spera did marry, they divorced, and then they lost track of the family. No one knew what became of them. During this time, I was using my heritage again and again, right? How many times, I'm told that genealogy is the most Googled subject behind pornography. So apparently a lot of people are spending time Googling their families and on these genealogy websites. So I was doing everything I could, and I kept coming up empty. At the time, the owner of this website, MyHeritage, who is an Israeli man, the company's based in Israel, he heard about the Greek-American girl in New York who was trying to find the family her grandmother saved from the Nazis. And he said, well, I'm going to do a mitzvah, a good deed. And I'm going to try to help this girl, see if I can discover this family. And the very first night, he dove in. And he started looking for Spera. And this man is brilliant. There are a lot more details in the book, which I hope you will pick up and read, but let me just share with you one of the things that he did. Gilad, this brilliant genealogist in Israel, reasoned, well, Spera is a name that women in Israel don't really use. There's no one, there's no one here in Israel that uses the name Spera. So then he said, okay, Spera comes from the name Esperanza, which means hope. Hope, in Hebrew, do we have any Hebrew speakers here? Anyone know what hope in Hebrew is? Tikva. The name for hope in Hebrew is Tikva, which is a quite common name. So Gilad went through all the records of all the manifests of anyone that emigrated to Israel from Greece after the war with the name Tikva. And he found several. But he found one on a tiny street in Tel Aviv, right here, this end of the street. And then he went searching for Rosa, the little girl who was orphaned, but stayed with Savas and the family and was hidden with them. And he searched for all the women named Rosa who emigrated to Israel from Greece after the war. And he found several. But the very first one on that list lived just at the other end of that tiny street in Tel Aviv. And he realized that it must be them, because after all these women went through, what they must have suffered through, sacrificed, and lost, when they finally got to Israel, he was certain that they wanted to be near one another. And that was them, and he found them. And I had the honor of calling Spera's granddaughter in Los Angeles and saying to her, I think our grandmothers were friends. And I said to her, my grandmother is one of the women who saved your grandmother on that tiny Greek island. And do you know what she said? What are you talking about? She had no idea. No idea. Because like so many Holocaust survivors, when they finally got through the war, when they finally survived, they lost everyone and everything. Number one, people didn't believe them. Those who came back from the camps and told them what had happened, people didn't believe them. And then others, when they got to Israel, were told, forget what's happened in the past, your life begins fresh now. Look forward, your life begins today. Never look back, look forward. And so Spera never told her family about this entire island, including my grandmother, who risked everything to save her. She never told her family. They had no idea. And then I tracked down Rosa's family. Rosa has two sons and three granddaughters in Israel. And I reached out to them too, and they had no idea. No idea at all. In fact, Rosa's sons told me that every year in their childhood, on Holocaust Remembrance Day, they had to sit quietly and mournfully. They couldn't speak, they couldn't laugh, no TV, no radio. They had to be mourning every Holocaust Remembrance Day. But they had no idea who they were mourning for because she never talked about her family. Never once spoke of it. They had no idea about their Greek roots, Greek heritage, or how everyone risked their lives. None of it. It was unbelievable. Unbelievable. So a year after I found them, we all gathered together in Greece. We went together to the Jewish quarter, and we walked through the narrow cobblestone lanes, and they got to see where their family was from and where they're from. And we went together to the synagogue, the one standing synagogue. There were 3 during the war. 2 were bombed, 1 survived. It's been beautifully refurbished. The Jewish community of Corfu now only has 60 people and 1 synagogue, but they are a beautiful community who feel that they were forgotten by time and by history, and that no one cared until now. Because now, because of our story, because of our investigation, and because we care about this family and finding them, Not only did we bring Rosa and Spera's families back to Greece, back to the Jewish community, we also brought them back to Eriquisa, and they got to meet some of the surviving rescuers, the people who risked their lives to save their mothers. And with us on that trip was a representative of the International Raoul Wallenberg Foundation who came with us and bestowed the House of Life honor on my grandmother's island. That little island, not even found on most maps, forgotten by everyone, has now been bestowed as a House of Life. And not only that, our little island is featured on a stamp in Israel. Amazing, right? Amazing. And there's more. I have some new news for you. Because of all that's happened, we've gone in with the wonderful people at MyHeritage, and we've built up the family tree and history of this lost community of Corfu. Because of this, there is a Holocaust survivor in Israel. Her name is Nata. Because of Dr. Mengele's sadistic experiments, she was not able to have children. She married another Holocaust survivor. They never had children. They moved to Israel. She was widowed and alone in the world. She had no one, no children, no family, nothing. She lost everyone in the Holocaust. Because of our work with the Jewish, in the Jewish community of Corfu, we've been able to reunite Nata with family that she never knew existed. So she'll never be alone again. The Israeli Ministry of Education heard about our story. And I'm very happy to report that as of next year, the curriculum for high school students in Israel will include a lesson on not only the Greek Jews, the Jewish community of Corfu, and our secret of Eriquisa. Amazing, right? Because I stopped to pay attention to my grandmother's story, a long-forgotten story, a story that would have been lost to history, right? A chapter, an incredible chapter of a history book that was in my old family photo album, forgotten to history. But we brought it back, and we're encouraging others to do the same. Because it's only by recording these stories, stopping and paying attention, and learning from the mistakes that I made, that we can go in and save these incredible stories, because they are valuable and they're important and they mean so much. But there's another aspect to this story. Excuse me. This is where it gets difficult. So, on April 10th of 2014 is when I found the family that my grandmother saved from the Nazis on this little Greek island. April 13th of 2014, there was a shooting in Kansas. I'm sure many of you will recall. There was a shooting at a JCC in Overland Park, Kansas. Right, so you remember, there were 3 people murdered by a neo-Nazi who wanted to know what it felt like to kill Jews before he died. He was sick, he thought he was dying. So he drove to the JCC and he waited. And he saw 2 people get out of a car and he shot and killed them. Those were members of my family. My 14-year-old nephew, Reet, and his grandfather were murdered by a man shouting Heil Hitler 3 days after I found the family my grandmother saved from the Nazis. The man then went down the street to the Village Shalom nursing home and he murdered a 3rd woman. She was there visiting her mother in the nursing home that day. This man set out to kill Jews and he murdered 3 Christians that day. Among them, my 14-year-old nephew, Reet, who was going to an audition. They were at the JCC for a singing audition. The night of the murders. Now, mind you, many of you know my children, right? You guys know my kids, Nico and Christiana. Nico, my son, my baby, was 9 when his cousin was killed, 9 years old. The night of the murders, I tucked him into bed. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. I went to his room and he was still awake. Now, mind you, this whole incredible story I told you about my family, my children lived and experienced this with me. I drilled it in their heads. I drove them crazy. Excuse me. Look where you come from. Look where you come from. Look what your family stands for. Stand up and do the right thing always, no matter what's going on around you. No matter if the world is going insane around you, you always follow your heart and your judgment, and you do the right thing. Like your great-grandmother did, like everybody on that island did. Right? How many people turned in their friends all across Europe because they were fearful, because the Nazis told them they had to do it? How many people died because of that? But how many people stood up and listened to their own moral barometer? My grandmother was one of them. And I said this to my children, look where you come from. That is your family. That is who you are. And the night of the murders, as I climbed into bed with Nico at 1 o'clock in the morning, he turned to me with tears in his eyes and he said, but I don't understand, Mom. I said, I know, honey, nobody understands you. He goes, no, I don't understand. You told me the family survived and the Nazis were gone. How could this happen? What do you say to that? How do you answer that question? What do you say to a child to make him understand that? I don't understand it. How can you rationalize the irrational? How can you make sense of the senseless? Maybe you can, I can't. I can't, it's impossible. And so I wrestled with this. And I wrestled with, how do I answer this? What do I say to my children? How do I try to make sense of it when there's no sense to be made of it? And then I looked at our family in Kansas. Mindy Corporon is my cousin. She lost her son and her father that day. Immediately, the night of the murders, when they pulled her into that small room in the hospital and told her that her son didn't make it, the very first words out of her mouth were, he was an organ donor. We have to donate his organs because someone else has to live. And then she said, something good has to come from this. Something good has to come from this. And she has dedicated her life to making sure something good comes from this. Because this woman who lost her son, this was the light of her life, this kid, lost her son and her father, who was her best friend in the world. The two people dearest to her are gone. But Mindy mobilized because she too refused to let hate have the last word, just like my grandmother did. Because she refused to let her son and father, the most beautiful people that she knew, go down in history as victims of a hate crime. Because that's not who they were. That's not what they stood for. Bill and Rita should not be known as victims of a hate crime. They were catalysts of love and goodness and light. And so because of that, Mindy has channeled all of her energy into a foundation called Faith Always Wins. And she has now dedicated her life to making sure that her son and her father are remembered for putting acts of goodness and kindness into the world. She started a foundation to bring together people of all faiths and cultures. She's on a mission to erase interfaith intolerance and to spread education and love. Because when you educate someone, when you learn about someone's culture, someone's faith, you realize that maybe they're different, but it's not so different, right? Where does hate and ignorance come from? Lack of knowledge. Lack of knowledge. So she's on a mission to try to make sure people are aware and know and learn with the hopes that this doesn't happen again. But sadly, we see it is happening again and again. And not only is it happening again, but since 2014, when my nephew and his grandfather were murdered by a man who still then lived in the shadows, now we have Nazis marching freely on the streets of this country. How is that possible? I told Nico the Nazis were defeated. They're gone. But they're marching on the streets of this country. How do I answer Nico's question? So I wrestled with what he asked me, and it stayed with me, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. And my book, Something Beautiful Happened, is my attempt to answer Nico's question. It's my attempt to show him that while I will always do my very best to answer my children's questions, I don't have all the answers because I don't understand. My mind doesn't work that way. My heart doesn't work that way. But what I do know is that 70 years ago, during the darkest days of the Holocaust, and today, in this country, right now in the United States of America, our family has stood up to Nazi hate and evil, and we refuse to let hate have the last word. And that's what I tell my children, and that's what I remind them of, and that's what's important. And that's what I hope I leave you guys with. is like just as this community came together in Greece 70 years ago to change the course of history and one family's fate, that's what our family is doing with their foundation. They're changing the narrative. Changing the narrative from victim to survivor. My cousin Mindy is a survivor, and she's out to change the world. And if anybody will, believe me, she will. And that's what's important, that we remember this, and we remember these stories. And we remember the people that we lost. And we use their memories as catalysts of change. And we use our voices as choruses to drown out the hate. Because it is possible. We have to believe it's possible. Because we've proven it can be done. It can be done. And I think now, more than ever, it's so vitally important that we continue to do that and learn from those and be inspired by those who did. Because when you look at history, why should history remember the names of the people who perpetrated the crimes? Why? Let's remember the ones who stood up and did something beautiful and right and light in the darkest moments. Because that's what's important. That's what we should be spreading. That's what should be in the history books. So I wrote my own book. Because that's what I wanted in the book. And that's the lesson I find. And that's what I want my children to remember. And I also wanted them to remember and to look at me and my mistakes. Because I made a lot of mistakes along the way. I didn't pay attention. I never paid attention until it was too late. And so I hope all of you in this room, especially the students, right? You have that iPhone, like hermetically sealed to your hand, always, always. I tell my kids, get off Facebook, get off Snapchat, sit down with your grandparents, have a conversation, turn the phone on them, ask them about their lives, record it, because you're going to be so grateful that you have that one day. You know, over the holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, you're in the kitchen making grandma's favorite recipe. Record her, document her making that old family recipe, because that's history too. And if we don't stop to pay attention and document these things, they'll be lost forever. Because the story of Savas Israel came so close to being lost to history. So close. So very close. And now it's being taught in every school in Israel. And do you know what joy it gave me? All the Holocaust survivors that I befriended along the way, along this multi-year journey, visiting them in Greece and Israel, to go back now, the ones who told me, no one cared, we were forgotten by history, no one cared about us, to go back and tell them, not only have you not been forgotten, but your story is being taught in schools. That was the greatest moment of my life. The greatest. So please, 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 hear our story, be inspired to document your own, because I promise you, amazing, amazing things can happen when you do. So thank you. I'm happy to take some questions, but before we do, not only is our story being taught in high schools in Israel, but I've also, as you heard, I'm a television producer, so I've also produced a documentary on our story, which we are furiously writing and editing to meet our deadline. But this is a little snippet of it I'd like to share with you.
There was intensive bombing in the western part of Greece.
There were about 2,000 Jews in Corfu at the time. The Nazis came in, they literally ripped them from their homes.
They didn't know that they were going to a death camp.
My grandmother told me that everyone here risked their lives to save this family, despite the fact that the Nazis went door to door hunting for escaped Jews.
Nobody gave them up.
Not one person on the island gave up the secret.
They blew them out.
And the family survived. But we didn't really know what became of them after that. I grew up listening to my grandmother's story. I wanted to finish telling the story that she had started. I wanted to find this family. I was told by many, many people, you're never going to find them. It became an obsession. I think our grandmothers may have known each other.
That's Sommer. That's definitely him. Amazing.
It's okay. No worries.
Everything had come full circle. 3 days later, everything changed.
We now know the identity of 2 of the 3 shooting victims.
On April 13th, my 14-year-old nephew Reet and his grandfather were killed by a madman shouting Heil Hitler at a JCC in Kansas.
Dr. Corcoran died at the scene. Reed later died at the hospital.
During the Holocaust, my grandmother helped save the life of a Jewish family. And now in Kansas today, our family is devastated because someone thought that 2 members of our family were Jewish.
Because of your hate and your evil, you murdered my dad and my son. But they picked the wrong family because we're not going to stand for it. We want something good to come out of this.
אני מרגיש שאנחנו משפחה.
It's a story of finding the light in the darkest moment. Because otherwise, darkness will win, and we can't let that happen.
So this documentary is going to be shown in the schools in Israel along with the lesson plan, and I could not be happier. So, thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions. Yes?
Do you know any details about the Taylor and his daughters and Rosa living, you said living in plain sight, so they
Yes.
didn't go into a cave or something? Or
No, I mean, there are many, many details, and I detail everything that I know is in the book, but I'll give you some glimpses. So they managed to escape to the island. We're not quite sure how they got there. I went to Israel and I interviewed Rosa's best friend, and she said that Rosa was not home when the Nazis were there, and that they were on Erikusa delivering clerical garments that they made for the priests, and that's how they were not in the Jewish quarter. But when they got to the island, my grandmother and a group of other women discarded their clothing. Again, they were tailors, they had much nicer clothing, and they dressed them in the peasant clothing of the islanders. They hid them first in the priest's home. The priest's home is called a keli, and the priest left his little home and went and lived someplace else, so the Jewish family had a place to hide. So they were hiding in plain sight, but they really stayed out of sight. They were living in the home, dressed as Christians, and then at night, when, of course, everyone would go into their homes, at nightfall, the girls would leave the house and go, never using any candles or anything because they didn't want to draw attention, and they would tiptoe, go to my grandmother's house, which is about a half a mile away. Now, mind you, the Germans didn't occupy our island, but they would come periodically, searching. When the fishermen, the early morning fishermen, would see the German boats approaching, the islanders would warn each other, right? They would run to the homes. One of the group of women, would tell the Jewish Savas' family that the Germans were coming, and they would take them to the other side of the island, which was this uninhabited wild side of the island. They lived in an abandoned shack, and one of my aunts told me that they would cook by digging into the sand and putting fire in the sand, and they'd bring them little pots to cook in. So the women would take turns walking to the other side of the island to bring them supplies until they were told it was safe to come back. Yeah, it was amazing, right? Yes. Yes. So Spera and Rosa eventually made it to Israel. Spera and Rosa boarded an illegal refugee ship called the Henrietta Zold. Spera was 20 and Spera was 19 and Rosa was 9. And Spera refused to leave Greece without Rosa. They were very close. So this illegal refugee ship made it to the shores of what was then mandatory Palestine because it wasn't Israel yet. Immediately, they were seized upon by British soldiers who turned them around and sent them to a British refugee camp for 2 years. So these young girls who went through so much were now alone in a British refugee camp for 2 years. After that time, they finally made it to Israel. And now, knowing that, you can kind of understand when they were told, never look back, your life begins today. perhaps why they might not ever look back. Now, the other daughters, Julia and Nina, left Corfu and they went to Athens where they worked as seamstresses. Nina ended up marrying a man she said she would never marry, but apparently she fell deeply in love when she was about 50 years old and married. And Julia also found love late in life, but it was quite scandalous because she married a Christian and converted for him, but she ended up being buried in a Jewish cemetery, so I'm not really sure how that worked out. But anyway, so at the end, the most wonderful part of the story is that after everything they went through, every single one of Savas's daughters did find love in their lives by the end of their lives. Yes?
Did you find it hard to get the pieces of your story because people were reluctant to look back in the past and talk about it?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, when you show up, right, on an island that was occupied, looted, and basically the entire Jewish community was decimated by the Nazis, and you show up 70 years later saying, hey, I'm looking for information about a Jewish family, trust me, no one's going to help you right away. Because people go back and, you know, people are looking for property that was stolen. They're looking for homes that were taken over, any number of reasons. And it takes a lot of time and effort and energy to gain people's trust. And at first it was very challenging to go back to Corfu and say, hey, I'm this Greek-American girl and I really want you to tell me everything you know about this Jewish community. They're not so forthcoming, but after a while I earned their trust. And what I did find, which was life-changing, and it wasn't just me, it was the incredible researchers at myheritage.com who basically dedicated themselves to helping me solve this mystery. They came with me to Corfu, to the archives in Corfu. Corfu's archives are extraordinary. Corfu, as I said, is in the northwestern part of Greece. Now, the rest of Greece had been occupied by the Ottoman Empire, right, and the Turks, who would go in, their MO was they would go in to a Greek territory island, they'd burn everything down and make it their own. The Turks never occupied Corfu. It was occupied by the Venetians, by the French, and by the British. The Turks, the Ottoman Empire, were defeated every time they tried to occupy Corfu. So there is a vast, incredible archive that goes back to Venetian times. I was in this archive and I was pulling up maps of plantations from the Venetian time where every olive tree and cypress tree is beautifully painted. I mean, they're like works of art. So it was a treasure trove of information. It took a while to gain the trust of the archivist, but with persistence we did. And they were, you know, incredibly helpful and became our partners in this giant mystery. Yes?
It's my understanding that before the war, there was a substantial Jewish population in northern Greece.
Yes.
And also
On
the island, the Sea of Sommer. Do we know anything about that population? Was that totally decimated? Are people there today?
I'm not sure what island you're talking about, but I do know that you're probably talking about Thessaloniki, Salonika, which was and that community was decimated. So I believe it was about 85% of Greece's Jewish population was killed in the Holocaust. But there are stories, though, of incredible bravery. In fact, in Athens, Bishop Damaskinos, who was the head of the Greek Orthodox Church in Athens, he stood up and issued false baptismal certificates that saved thousands of Jews. But not only that, he also stood up and issued a decree to all the priests across Greece, and he said, it is your obligation to save your Jewish brothers and hide them in your home. Now remember, where was Savas and his family hidden? In the priest's home. Now the Germans got wind of this. Bishop Damaskinos is credited with saving thousands and thousands of Jews. The Germans got wind of this, and they wrote to him, and they said, we know what you're doing, and if you don't cease and desist, we will shoot you. The bishop wrote back, in our church, the priests are hanged and not shot. Please respect the traditions of our church. And also in Zakynthos, on the island of Zakynthos, there were 1,000, I think maybe 1,500 Jews, if I'm not mistaken. And on that island, German command went to the police chief and the mayor. I'm sorry, the bishop and the mayor. And they said, we need you to provide us with a list of all the Jews on this island by tomorrow morning.
The next morning, they went, they handed the Germans a list, and they said, here are your Jews. 2 names, their names. Every Jew was saved on that island. So while there were horrible stories, and sadly 85% of the population was in fact murdered, there are incredible stories all across Greece of incredible bravery. Thank you.
I was just going to ask you both, mention multiple, first of all, thank you for sharing your story.
And thank you for coming.
Yes, multiple rejections of your first book. Did you make changes, or did you just keep, what triggered the success?
Every time I got a rejection, some were harsher than others. I believe one told me that it would never be published. Another said, I wish the writing had been better. Sorry. Every time I got a rejection or a note, I would look at it, and I would go back in, and if I thought it would make the book better, I would. So I just revised, and it's true what they say, right? Good books are not written, they're edited. And so I went back and I edited and edited and edited, and finally it got to the point where I was like, okay, this is the book. And it's true what it takes one person. It takes one person to believe in you and see your vision. And I found that one person in my agent, this incredible woman named Nina Bedonia, and she got it. She got it. And she said to me, and this was, again, after years of rejection, Amy knows, you guys lived through it with me. She remembers. All right, many tears over wine. I've just wasted how many years of my life writing this book. But she got it. And she said to me, she goes, you know, it's a process. It's a process. I don't know what's going to happen. We're going to send it out. We have a long list of editors. Here's my list. The very top editor, the number 1 on my list, she's never going to buy your book. Her name is Claire Wachtel. Let's just send it to her, and then we'll work our way down the list. And then when we get to the second list, eventually someone's going to buy it. I'm confident. Well, guess who bought the book? The very first editor on that list, the Dream Reach editor, who we never thought would look at us. Bought it immediately. So you never know. One person to believe in you. Anyone else? Well, thank you. Yes, hello. Hi.
Your father, did he know of the stories of you from your grandmother?
Yes.
So was he able to help you in?
Yeah. He did. You know, and my father is still alive. And so for him to see this and witness what's happened, because you know, it's amazing, and he can't even believe it. But yeah, he was able to help me, but only so much. I mean, we knew what we knew. We knew they were there. We knew what happened in our home. We knew how the island helped them, but we didn't know how to find them. That was the mystery. How do we find them? Yes.
Soft topic. I'm guessing that the Jewish population, in addition to speaking Greek, probably spoke Latino.
Yes.
So they're actually from the Sephardic.
Yes. So there's Sephardic and Romaniot, I believe, is the other. Yeah.
Well, I just had one more comment. My grandmother was from Salonica.
Really?
She came she probably came here in 1905 or 1910, and she brought her whole family over. But the New York Times about 15, 20 years ago had an article that in Salonica during war there were 36,000 Jews, and at the end about 1,000 returned. So I have that Greek heritage from my grandmother.
Yeah.
She was from Salonica.
Do you know the Kahila Kadosha Synagogue in Lower Manhattan? You should get in touch with them. There's a wonderful, extraordinary woman, and if you read the book, there's a lot about her in there. She's my Greek-Jewish fairy godmother. Her name is Marcia Economopoulos. She's the museum director, and she runs the synagogue. And it's the only Greek-Jewish synagogue in the United States, I believe. And she's extraordinary. She's a wealth of information. If you wanted to find any family history, I'm sure she could help you.
Well, and my grandmother did speak Ladino, so did my mother and my grandmother and her whole family. But she was one of 17 children, my grandmother. Not all of them survived, not because of the war, but in those days they just died. But she brought over all her sisters and brothers with one of the other brothers and her mother and father as well. Thank you.
Anyone else? All good? Thank you.